Yes. Hi, this is Super Dave checking in. I'm getting really excited because Superman 3 is coming up on its 40th anniversary, and in a few days, I will do a 40th anniversary commentary on the film. Today, I received a book on Kindle from Amazon compiling interviews that I was very familiar with in the past. Interviews done by Ed Gross from Voices from Krypton, and interviews compiled over many, many years, including interviews done at the time of Superman 3. At another time, I'll go back and read the comments about Superman 1, Superman 2, Supergirl, and Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. Today, I want to focus on primary quotes concerning Superman 3. What I mean by primary are the people who actually worked on the film, not modern day critics who were looking at it. That's valuable, but the actual people who worked on the film, either speaking at the time um, or speaking maybe in more modern time. But obviously, the people who have passed, you know, they gave interviews a long time ago. But let's get started on this, and I hope you enjoy this. Straight continuity. Straight continuity. That's the way director Richard Lester describes the genesis of Superman 3, a sequel that had to be produced given the worldwide success of the first two entries in the series. The question, though, was where to take the Man of Steel next. Richard Lester says, when you're in the third of a series and a man has a certain amount of power and you have to find a way to destroy his invincibility in order to create a story, you begin to think, oh dear, we've done that before. These are the powers on a certain scale we can work with, and yes, you do begin to run out of ideas. Aside from that, I don't think the script for Superman 3 was that difficult to develop. We deliberately tried to make it as unlike the other two as possible. Again, Richard Lester speaks. But preceding that, just a little explanation here. There he comes together with his first love, though he probably never knew it, Lana Lang. In direct contrast to his life in Metropolis, Clark finds he doesn't have to be a complete nebbish and that Lana is falling for him, not Superman. This is what Richard Lester, the director, says. Margot certainly didn't want to be involved, and I tried to find a fairly elegant compromise whereby she wouldn't simply disappear, but where she didn't have to be involved with the producers or the film in any major way. Considering her feelings, I think she was very nice to do it. I admired her because she was really doing it for Chris and me. Now, writer David Newman. During the shooting of the Niagara Falls sequences of Superman 2, that would have been in September of 1979, Leslie and I were sitting in a restaurant in this hotel, and there was something about Niagara Falls being spoken about in terms of a place for young couples to go. I had been to my own class reunion 2 years before, and we started talking about the fact that there was nowhere else to go with the Superman slash Lois love story. We didn't want to do the same thing again. Then we were talking about Frank Capra movies, and about going back home again and the notion that you can't go home again. Then the whole Lana Lang slash Superman idea of going back to Smallville began. Annette O'Toole, actress who played Lana Lang in Superman 3. Lana sees the real person with whom she grew up. As a teenager, Lana was more impressed with football heroes. Now she realizes that Clark was the guy she enjoyed talking to and being with the most. Everybody in Metropolis knows him from the act. Everybody in Metropolis knows him from the act he puts on for them. Lana knew him as a boy. She has all this other background on him that no one else knows. To her, he's just a normal man. Christopher Reeve, that was an opportunity for Clark to become a full, Christopher Reeve states, that was an opportunity for Clark to become a more fully rounded character whose behavior is not limited to bumping into walls. He realizes when he gets back to Kansas that the clumsiness, he uses in the city is merely a disguise. If Lana Lang is attracted to him, he should have something more to offer than awkwardness. I think the audience enjoyed seeing a new side to him. And those were press notes, I assume, from the time of 83, when the movie came out. Or, 82 when he was making the movie. Back to Annette O'Toole. Excuse me. Chris and I got together and talked. His ideas were very similar to mine. To not make this story a cartoon, but to play it as people who have real problems. We discussed what kind of relationship Lana and Clark would have, and so it was very, very pleasant. We were playing people who had an early relationship, so we sort of had to fill that area in. We would just sit, talk. We didn't even have to talk that much and watch what was happening. I found Chris to be a very calming person. He handled all the super pressure of being Superman very well. From those first days, he made me feel at home. This newcomer added to something which had been going on for 5 years, because, the first Superman and a lot of the second was done 5 years earlier in 1977. Superman 3 was filmed in 1982. My note. Back to Annette O'Toole. I saw Lana as the young working mother. I looked at everyone in the film and who they represented in America. I always thought of Lois as the career woman. Lana was the symbol of all the girls who got married right out of high school, had a baby, and were left behind. She's making it on her own and doing very well until Clark Kent re-enters her life. Now, she realizes there's this big hole. She wants something for herself again. That was the basic idea. We took it from there. I tried to keep it simple, and there's something very sweet about the lost love between Clark and Lana, and they're finding it again. Writer David Newman states, about 8 months after Leslie and I were talking in that restaurant, again referring back to Niagara Falls, Richard Lester brought us the next element for the script. Richard said, I want to do something about computers. I don't know what, but I think that's what's happening in the world today, and Superman 3 ought to reflect that. We thought about computers, and what we came up with is that they're running our lives, we don't know how, and that we're somehow threatened by them. Now, there's some commentary here written by the author, I assume. Gene Hackman had made it clear that he wouldn't be reprising the role of Lex Luthor, so the search began for a new villain. Reflecting Lester's desire for a computer-oriented story, the Newmans created industrialist Ross Webster, who is determined to use computer technology to enhance his fortune, no matter what the cost to others. Enabling him to do this is Gus Gorman, a good-natured, though misguided schnook who is somehow a whiz at computers and unwittingly creates the ultimate example of one, a machine powerful enough to kill Superman. To play the role of Webster, the production locked its sights on Robert Vaughn, probably still best remembered primarily for his role as Napoleon Solo in television's The Man from U.N.C.L.E. For the writers, there was also additional Kryptonian fodder in the quote unquote relationship between Clark Kent and Superman, an idea brought home when Gus Gorman exposes the Man of Steel to a piece of artificial kryptonite, which psychologically splits him into two separate beings, Clark and Superman. And this Superman ain't a happy camper. Writer David Newman. One of our favorite things about the character is, and always has been, the classic split personality. There's Jekyll and Hyde and Clark and Superman. The thing that never occurred to anyone as much as it occurred to us when we wrote the film was that it always seems that they didn't like each other. The id and superego battled each other all the time. I was very pleased with the way the film came out, and I think some of the best work Christopher Reeve has done as an actor is in Superman 3 with the evil Superman character. Director Richard Lester says, the splitting of Clark and Superman was fun to do. The actual fight between them was wonderful, and cutting it together was great fun. Then writer David Newman states, it's wonderful the way that happens in degrees. There's that little scene with Lana Lang when he starts to come on to her instead of going to stop the bridge from collapsing. In the big fight between Clark and Superman in the auto graveyard, I think, and with the big fight between Clark and Superman in the auto graveyard, I think he's just great. It was the first thing shot in that movie, too. They started with the hardest part. Now, this is a Super Dave comment that I'm making. It seems that the context and the thrust of that comment by David Newman gives strong evidence that the junkyard fight was the first scene shot in the movie. Christopher Reeve has made statements that it was the first scene that was shot in the movie, and that he was on solid for 2 weeks from 7 a.m. till 6 p.m. Now, the part where they're referencing the little scene with Lana Lang where he starts to come on to her, okay, it's possible that was on day one, but I think the major thrust is, as long as the weather permitted, they were filming the junkyard outside. I think finally I would have to believe that if he says they started with the hardest part, technically, from a filmmaking standpoint, not just a storytelling standpoint, the hardest part of the movie is taking one actor and having him play two characters. And Paul Weston, the stuntman, and Christopher Reeve mainly filmed that scene. More on that when we get to the Superman 3 commentary. Let's get back to Voices from Krypton. Now, director Richard Lester states, once we had all that, it was my idea to get Richard Pryor as Gus Gorman because I wanted to play around with the idea of this very realistic element to go along with the splitting of Superman's personality. Richard works in a very realistic style, and the game was to see whether or not it could work. This is what Christopher Reeve says. In the other movies, we started big with the explosion of Krypton in outer space and the arrival on Earth of 3 supervillains. Here, we begin with something as simple as a matchbook cover and move outwards to epic situations. Richard represents the audience. It's as if someone was plucked out of his seat in a movie house and dropped into the movie. His comedy grows out of the hopes and pains of everyday people. And when the everyday man comes up against Superman, it's interesting to see what happens. Without losing any of the fantasy and with more humor, this story comes closer to contemporary life than we had before. Those are press notes. Now, this is, I believe, Ed Gross, the author, making a comment here. Despite Lester's desire to use Pryor to bring more realism to the film, most people, particularly the critics, thought that his appearance made the film too light and threw off the balance. So bad a taste did it ultimately leave that several years later, when it was mentioned that Eddie Murphy might co-star in 1986's Star Trek IV, everyone said that it was a misstep akin to Pryor being cast in Superman 3. Now, I don't agree with that, but that's what a lot of the critics had to say. Back to David Newman, the writer. The way Richard Pryor got involved is that Leslie and I were watching Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Carson asked him what he was doing next, and Richard replied, "I'm waiting to see the next Superman movie. Boy, do I love Superman, and I'd do anything if I could be in one of those pictures." At that point, light bulbs went off, so we created the character for him. Once you get Richard Pryor, obviously you're getting lighter. I think Christopher feels that what happened on 3 was not that Richard Pryor was in it, but that the balance was tipped in Pryor's favor or too much towards the Gus Gorman part of the story. Back to director Richard Lester. Actually, I wanted more of a balance between the two stories and had cut some of Richard Pryor's scenes out. But Warner Brothers insisted that they be put back in. That might have hurt the film. Writer David Newman states, again, it's the Gus Gorman part of it which Christopher felt didn't belong. His own character he loved. That part we all felt was as mythic and deep. That part we all felt was as mythic and deep as anything could be. The fact that Superman splits. Where it got lighter, obviously, was with Gorman. Now, this is Leslie Newman, the wife of David Newman and the co-writer on Superman 3. But let's be realistic. When you have someone like Richard Pryor, the studio wants more than you might necessarily want to do. It's a fine line in how you approach it. When we did the first film, you could not have somebody saying up, up, and away, or look, it's a bird, it's a plane, or change in a phone booth. It would have been horrendous. It's a funny kind of balance you have to pull off. Back to writer David Newman. And again, David and Leslie Newman are a husband-wife team. They're both passed, but they're a husband-wife writing team. If you look at Richard Lester's films, he loves slapstick and gags. Excuse me. And we wrote for the director. We had a great time doing the opening scene in Superman 3, where one disaster leads into another one. We wrote the traffic light business, where the two signals fight each other, and it still makes me giggle. It is comical, and maybe some people feel it's too much. Some people have a certain kind of rigidity, if I'm pronouncing it right. Rigidity. Janet Maslin's review in the New York Times said, in essence, why don't they leave well enough alone? Why do they try new things with that character? What she's saying is that each movie should go on doing the exact same thing. It's very ironic. Leslie Newman, then they write a review saying they do the same old thing. Why don't they do something different? Back to David Newman. Then you get those Rocky IV reviews at the same time saying, I think I've seen this movie 4 times. Leslie Newman. Plus, we were hitting a problem with the Lois character. It's silly to do the same thing. The Lana Lang romance is not on the scale of a Lois romance. It's on a lighter scale as well. David Newman states, the trickiest thing about these kinds of movies is you walk a very thin line concerning tone. One false move and you're into camp or you're into Saturday morning cartoons. It's very tricky, and I suppose we haven't always been right, but it's much harder than people think. It's not the Penguin going around saying, ha ha, Batman, I'll get you and your little friend. It's a lot easier writing Ghostbusters than a superhero movie. Now, this is a comic book writer, Carrie Bates. Halfway through production of Superman 3, DC sent me to Pinewood Studios in 1983 as their official representative in meetings with Elia, Pierre Spengler, Richard Lester, and Leslie and David Newman. There were concerns over the tone of the film leaning too much toward Richard Pryor at Superman's expense, but we were stymied by Lester. I don't know what the word stymied means. I guess, prevented by Lester, and our efforts proved to be too little, too late. But it was the beginning of my long-running association and friendship with Elia. Just as a side note, my own comments, Cary Bates and then also Mark Jones collaborated with Elia Salkin in the TV show Superboy, which ran from 1988 to 1992. And also Cary Bates and Mark Jones, along with Elia Salkin helping with the story, wrote a draft for a potential Superman 5 that never got made. First called Superman the New Movie, later called Superman Reborn. But unfortunately, the rights went back to Warner Brothers. I guess Warner Brothers didn't have enough confidence but in the Salkins doing more Supermans. But that's another story for another time. Let's get back to Superman 3. Writer David Newman states, one thing about that movie that is structurally strange is that we never brought those two stories together until very close to the end of the movie. In Superman 2, the three stories combined in the middle. In this one, they combined, but the Gus Gorman character didn't really come into contact with Superman until the end of the movie. So a lot of what Richard did was without Chris, and a lot of what Chris did was without Richard. If you talk to Chris, he'll tell you that the scene which distresses him is when Gus Gorman skis off the building with the tablecloth around his neck. I still think it's funny. It's not epic, and it is lighter, and it is comedy. I don't want to apologize for it, but it did go more in that direction. Executive producer Elia Salkin states, I think the problem with Superman 3 was that it got a little bit out of control. There was too much of Lester's Lesterisms, quote unquote. The humor went too far, like the green and red traffic signals fighting each other. Things like that were just over the top. But it was his cast, and he could do what he wanted. That was the agreement, that he would have his cast and film whatever he wanted to. That was the agreement, that he would have his cast and film whatever he wanted to. He actually put in a scene where Pryor falls from the terrace on skis. That was from one of his rushes, and he put it in. I did like the scene where Superman is fighting himself. Just fantastic. And one of the best scenes in the entire series. Writer Leslie Newman. The reviews weren't as positive as they had been for the first two films, but the best reviews we got on 3 were the best reviews we've gotten. One doesn't mind negative reviews if they're the type that you can learn something from, if they're constructive. Writer David Newman. Sure, mixed reviews bothered me, but I've had a lot of movies open and close with all kinds of reviews, so I think I know how to live with that. It performed well, and that's really the bottom line. People are entitled to their opinions, and I'm not going to pass the buck. That is our movie, and that's the way we wanted it to come out. Maybe we were wrong. Writer Leslie Newman. What interested us may not have been what interested other people as much. To us, the notion of somebody loving Clark Kent and just thinking of Superman as a nice person was interesting, but other people might want to see somebody in love with Superman. Now, this is Christopher Reeve speaking. Dick Lester, who was responsible for the direction and who had the script. Let's clear the throat there. Christopher Reeve states, Dick Lester, who was responsible for the direction and who had the script written according to his specifications, As an American expatriate, he does not share the romantic, nostalgic view of America and Americans of Dick Donner. Dick Donner envisioned Superman as a Valentine to the country and to a time we dimly remember and sort of fantasize about. Dick Lester wants his comic book to be no more than a comic and deliberately places his tongue firmly in cheek and aims for fast, slick entertainment. I found that people tend to line up right down the middle. Some people might miss the romance and the weight and fleshiness of the characters. Other people say, thank God all that pompousness is over and we can get on to playing fastball. I don't take sides. I'm just saying for me what the sides are. The critics and the public decide for themselves. And that was in an interview with the Windsor Star. Now, this is what Ed Gross writes. Even before the release of Superman 3, it was pretty much decided that it would probably be the final entry in the series, even though the Salkinds contract gave them a total of 25 years to produce sequels, and that would have been from like 74 to 99. They got the rights in 74. Director Richard Lester. During the film's premiere, Chris Reeve and I went to the head of Warner Brothers and told him that this was it for us. It was over, even though I had enjoyed the whole 7-year period of the Superman films. I had a good time. Of course, they were the least personal films I've worked on, but they were very relaxing and technically fascinating. But I didn't want to carry on after that. It was enough for me. I certainly was running out of ideas, and I thought it needed a fresh eye and idea. Christopher Reeve states, Dick Lester was the first one to ask, how much further can you go without becoming a TV series in quality? We proved the man could fly. We've shown Superman in love. We've stopped time, turned the world backwards, and I don't know what you can do for an encore. If you look at the Bond movies, I think for me, the 3 real Bond movies are Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger. Full stop. The rest are basically a ripoff. Yes, they make money, and yes, you could probably continue, but I don't see the reward in it. Again, interview from the Windsor Star. Tom Mankiewicz, he was the creative consultant on the first 2 Superman movies and did an uncredited script writing on the first 2 Superman movies. After Superman 3 was made, Terry Semel came down to my office. He said, what's wrong with Superman 3? And I said, what's wrong with it? And it's not Richard's fault, but it's a Richard Pryor movie. I mean, he's wildly talented and he's very funny, but it's a Richard Pryor movie, and Superman movies have to be Superman movies. And he said, would you and Dick go back? Would you go back and do the next one? And really, price is no object. I mean, we want to get this back on track. And Dick and I had a long dinner and talked about it, and we thought, no, we'd done everything. We brought him from Krypton. He'd grown up. He turned the world backwards. He'd faced kryptonite. He'd become a human being and slept with Lois. Writer Leslie Newman. I still remember the film's premiere. There was a lot of hugging after the premiere with tears in the eyes and a lot of, God, it's been wonderful. But we really feel that we did what we wanted to do. We've always believed that the only reason to do a sequel is that if you have something more to say or something more to delve into. I want to repeat that. We've always believed that the only reason to do a sequel is that if you have something more to say or something more to delve into. Writer David Newman. When we finished Superman 3, every one of us, starting with Chris, said, no more Superman. It turns out we meant it, but Christopher didn't. And this kind of gives a segue into the future of Supergirl and Superman 4. So just a little taste, just a little hint, and then we'll go for now. Christopher Reeve. It's like if you eat too many chocolates, it puts you off for a while. If you have too much Italian food, you need to have sushi. It's just a change of diet, really. There's also the feeling that Superman 3 had diverted from the original intentions of making these movies. It had gone into parody. I felt, well, maybe it's just better not to do this anymore. But a couple of years go by, and everybody agrees that we should get back to the tone and style of the first one. We should go back to the basics. What people want to see is Clark and Lois and the legend of Krypton and Smallville and a real convincing villain. You can change your opinion and get remotivated again, and that's what happened to me. And this is in the Dayton Daily News. I'm assuming that Christopher Reeve was speaking those words around the time of Superman 4's development or production, release, etc. Ed Gross writes, the disappointing results of Superman 3, despite the fact that it turned a profit, was not assuaged, if I'm pronouncing that right, by the arrival of 1984 Supergirl, directed by Jaws 2's Jenna Schwartz, written by David Odell, produced by Ilya Salkin, and starring Helen Slater in the title role. The film was budgeted at $35 million and pulled in a global gross of a little over $14 million. So that gives segue into Supergirl and into Superman 4. I'd very much love to go back and, read on this YouTube channel, the Superman 1 and 2 saga, how that flowed together, and Supergirl, and also Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. Superman 3 is my favorite movie of all time. It came out theatrically on June 17th, 1983. It had its opening premiere in Washington, D.C. on June 12th, 1983. That was a Sunday. And in New York City on June 14th, 1983. That was a Tuesday. So in just a few days, I will be doing a public commentary on Superman 3. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and stay super.